itself was started. You notice how it goes down. Well, this had, a lot has this had eroded. They added more to it. Up there, they added even more dirt. Okay, so even though it is the oldest, some of the burials in here are not as old as you would anticipate they would be. One of the questions we're always getting, I don't think you can see it from here, is the cannon. When was the cannon added? It was added in 1927. Came from an armory around this area. It has never been fired. It has never been fired. But there it is, 1927. But well, it's right around the corner there. Okay.
Oh yeah, I see it now.
The two buildings here were actually constructed the same year, 1924. You'll see 1924 there. And if you look on your first page, or page 2 in there, it's a memorial chapel. It was put up by a church group. As I recall, the church group was part of the Methodist Church, put up in 1924 for the storage of bodies in the winter when the ground was too hard for them to actually dig a grave. Okay, and it's unused right now, except that they do store machinery and things such as that. Because they have no trouble in digging the graves now with the equipment that they have. That building over there, basically also put up in 1924, it replaced a building that was there before, which had two purposes. One was for the storing of equipment, and secondly, a privy. Okay. Now, that is, again, basically being used for the storage of equipment. I never did ask Bill Pick if they're still using it as a privy, but the previous building was used for that purpose. Obviously, there were two buildings before this, but exactly where they were in the cemetery, I don't know. Bill Pick does not know where they were. There had to be another one, because we do know that in 1920 there were several bodies that were brought here in the middle of January. Obviously, they could not dig any graves for them. They had to be stored someplace. And so there must have been another building or a previous building somewhere in this particular area here. Okay, now we move to we'll just simply start with this particular one here, and you'll notice a notation in the little booklet. This is Daniel Tobias, okay? Company D, 142nd Illinois Infantry Regiment, died 1922 at the age of 87. Civil War veteran. And when you see those little round markers, that indicates that they were veterans of one of the wars. Now, the 142nd Infantry Regiment, that would be very near the end of the war, because we never went beyond about 151 regiments in Illinois. Regiment would start out with 1,000 men altogether, 10 companies of 100 each. The 142nd was only enlisted for 1 year. For 1 year. It's getting near the end of the war. The main purpose for the 142nd, 43, 44, 45, 46 was primarily twofold. Number one was to guard prisoners that had been taken from the Confederacy, and these prisoners were stored in Chicago, at Camp Douglas, or Springfield, or several other areas. And the other thing was to guard those who had been drafted so they didn't desert. There were very few people who were drafted in Illinois. None were drafted in Stephenson County. Everyone from Stephenson County who served volunteered. But there were quite a number throughout the country, throughout the state, who did not volunteer. They were drafted, and they'd get to a camp. Security was kind of lax, and they just kind of wander off, and no one ever bothered to change it. Well, they would have the 142nd, 143rd. It was their job to make sure these guys didn't run away. Okay? Here, the one that you have next to that is John Kreider. Now, the Kreider family, of course, is very well known here. He was the son of the first Kreider, Daniel Kreider, who came to Stephenson County in 1842. He was a member of the 93rd Illinois Regiment. He was wounded May 22, 1863 at Champion Hill during the campaign to take Vicksburg. The campaign to take Vicksburg went on for many, many months, and Grant had this idea that, by George, we can charge up the hill and we can take that thing. Well, he tried charging up the hill at Champion Hill many times, and he lost hundreds and hundreds of troops. Well, one of them was John Kreider. He was not killed in that campaign, but in a short time later, about a year later, or a few years later, he died from his wounds. So the main purpose for showing that one is he is the son of one of the pioneer families here in Stevenson County. We get down then, we're approaching, we have the base. The story about Andrew Bates in and of itself is quite interesting, but I don't want to go into that today. It involves him and his future wife and his future wife's father, who did not like Andrew Bates at all. Okay. Then we come down to this section right here. This is for the Frys. Now, how many people know Paul Fry? Okay. All right. Here you have, here's Homer, Paul. You notice Paul does not have a death date on his because Paul is still alive. Paul is, 86, 87. He lives across the street from me. He is the last surviving pallbearer for Jane Addams' funeral. Now, he was 12 years old at the time. He said he was a tall, skinny boy. Paul and his 5 cousins, or one of his brothers, 4 cousins and his brother, the 6 of them were the pallbearers. Now, they actually did not carry the casket from the street up into the Addams home for the ceremony. They only did it the last several feet because they simply were not strong enough to do all that. Now, Paul and 4 of his cousins, their aunt was Mary Agnes Fry. Mary Agnes Fry, never married. At the age of 11, her father lost his wife, and as was the practice at that time, very often you would not have a formal adoption. You simply had some neighbor, some friend taking in your children. The second Mrs. John Addams, Anna Hostetter Holloman Addams, took in Mary Fry at the age of 11 to live in the house. And Mary Fry lived with the Addams, or was associated with the Addams family, until the day she died in 1952. Now, Paul in 1990 wrote a book which ostensibly was a biography of Mary Fry, but once you get past the first 2 chapters, which is really a detailed analysis of the Fry family and the Duth family, you then get into her relationship with the Addams family. And since Paul had access to a lot of Mary's letters and documents and stories that she would tell about the Addams family, Jane Addams, Marcette, and so forth, it's a very, very good book. We have it at the museum. If anyone is interested in buying it, you're going to read stuff in there which you are not going to find in the normal biography of Jane Addams. Mary died, as I said, in 1952, and her story is really, really quite an interesting story to read about. Okay. Now, I've thrown this particular one in here. You'll notice here, this is we have a monument for Ellen, wife of T.J. Moses. Okay, Ellen, it doesn't have a last name. Who is Ellen? She is the sister of George Saylor. Okay, George Saylor lived in the Cedarville area. He had a brother who was involved in business here as a millwright. Ellen Saylor was the second wife of T.J. Moses. T.J. Moses, that's Thomas Jefferson Moses. Thomas Jefferson Moses was in the Civil War in the 93rd Regiment, and he wrote his biography, and he kept part of a diary during the Civil War. We have copies of the diary, we have copies of his autobiography, we have a lot of pictures on the family. And very often we will use his diary and of the Civil War to fill into the gaps that we find in other diaries of people in the Civil War who served in the same campaign at the same time. So it's a wonderful thing for backing it up. So that's why Ellen, no last name, that's who it is. It is Ellen, well, Ellen Saylor Moses, Thomas Jefferson Moses. Thomas Jefferson Moses is part of the well-known Moses family that we had in Cedarville. In fact, their house, his I don't know. His uncle's house was on the corner of Stevenson Street and Wood Lane Drive. That's that big house there on the corner. That was the family house. Other relatives of his were the teacher, Edna Moses, Helen Moses, 3 teachers in the family.
Is TJ buried somewhere in this area as well?
No. He ended up in a nursing home, a soldier's nursing home in Iowa, and he died there. The only reason that she is buried here is because he died before she did, and the brother decided to bring the body here. Now, this one here I want to mention. This is William H Kreider. He served Company E, 146th Illinois Volunteer Infantry Regiment. That particular regiment, again, was a 1-year regiment similar to the 142nd. But there was a bit of a distinction here with Company E. Roughly 100 men. Company E, 146th Regiment. He was related to Daniel Kreider. Anyone have any idea what the 146th is known for in history? See, I know you didn't know that. Okay. When Lincoln was assassinated, his body was brought back to lay in state in Springfield. The 146th Regiment, Company E only, was detached from the 146th and was assigned to guard the casket when it laid in the State House and to be in the march that took them to the Oak Ridge Cemetery when they were buried at the time of burial. And William Kreider made a record of that particular event, and you can actually read it in his very short autobiography that he wrote. Okay. Now, this is what I call the Clingman Block. Okay. There are 2 major families in this particular section. One is the Klingmans, and the other are the Addams. They probably both had about as many members of their family buried as the other. We know there are at least 35 to 40 who are directly related to the Addams family. There are probably about as many that are related to the Clingman family. You'll see different names. You see Goidel. That's because one of the Clingmans married into the Goidel family. But the major portion of the Clingmans is right in here. The patriarch of the Clingman clan here is a man by the name of, would you believe, George Washington Clingman. George Washington Clingman. He died in 1856, and next to that is his wife, Mary Bright Clingman. I mentioned Mary Bright Clingman because anyone familiar with Jackson Richard? The Richard store. Okay? Alright. Jackson Richard was a first cousin of one of the Clingmans because his mother was the sister of Mary Bright. Now, when the Clingmans came here, which was in 1837, actually 7-8 years before the Addams family came here, they were led by Josiah Clingman. Josiah is buried over here. Next to him is his wife. They say Maria, I say Mariah, M-A-R-I-A-H, just like Josiah. And Josiah and Mariah brought with them Josiah's father and mother, and also one of his brothers. Josiah had one brother, John Bright Clingman. Okay. Bright obviously coming from the mother's maiden name. And at the same time, several of their cousins. There was Hiram, there's Abner, there was Cyrus, and of course Jackson Richard, who was the first cousin. All of these people were either related or they were neighbors coming from Portsmouth, Ohio. Okay, roughly 1837 to 1844 was this migratory period. Now, Portsmouth, Ohio, why coming from Portsmouth, Ohio? Well, at that particular time, you had a lot of floods. If anyone has ever been in Portsmouth, you have 2 rivers coming together, the Scioto River and the Ohio River. It floods. Okay, that's number 1 problem. Number two problem, with flooding, you get mosquitoes, you get malaria in that area. Also, these were basically farming families, and the law of primogeniture pretty much held sway, which means the oldest son got the land, the other ones had to go fend for themselves. The prices of land went up, so they decided to move farther west at that time. So for several reasons, between 1837, 1844, 1845, a lot of these people left Portsmouth and came here. We have other remnants of Portsmouth, Ohio here. Portsmouth, Ohio is in Scioto County. And so what do we have here? We have Scioto Mills, okay? Which basically, interesting, the Klingmans were all Germans, but Scioto Mills was, for all practical purposes, owned by a Scotch family, the Wilcoxons, okay? There was Reason Wilcoxon, there was Levi Wilcoxon, there was Thompson Wilcoxon, and we believe over here you see a monument for Walter Wilcoxon. Walter Wilcoxon, rather strange situation here. You notice he died in 1847. Okay? This cemetery did not exist in 1847. Probably the first burial that took place here might have been about 1851 when John Addams' first daughter died. And it was formally organized in 1855. But Walter Wilcoxon is buried here, even though he died in 1847. Obviously, his body was probably brought over here. And then, strangely enough, back here, monuments for 3 of his granddaughters. Okay? What happened to Walter Wilcoxon? Where did he die? The best information we have is that he died in Winslow, or in the Winslow area, according to the state of Illinois records. However, we have no one or no records in Winslow that let us know that that's where Walter Wilcoxon lived or he died. We don't know what happened to his sons and daughters. We don't know why his 3 granddaughters were buried here, but here they are. Okay, we will touch on Levi and Reason Wilcoxon a little bit later on. Okay, now as I indicated, a couple more I'd like to mention. Here you see those small monuments, and this one. This one is Thomas Klingman. He was mortally wounded in the Battle of Shiloh, which would have been in April 7th, 1862. And he was wounded actually in the leg, but he developed a gangrene, etc., and he died at home. Okay? Well, just like with Walter Wilcoxon, we believe that Walter Wilcoxon was probably buried in a family cemetery someplace and then moved here. The same thing is true with these 2. This represents, this is Chester and Edward Clingman, infant children less than a year old of the Klingmans. They were buried on a family cemetery just north of town by the homestead. We know there was a family cemetery up there because in a letter that Eliza Klingman, one of Thomas Klingman's sisters, wrote in 1867, she talks about the possibility that the railroad might run a line through the east end of the property where the family cemetery is. Okay, so our guess is that, and there's no record in the cemetery records here, that when Thomas Klingman died in 1863, that they decided, well, we're going to bury him here because the cemetery is now formed. We'll simply bring his 2 infant brothers up here and bury them also. So they are buried there at that particular point. This happens quite a number of times in here, and it's the only way in which we can explain why people are buried here prior, or appear to be buried here prior to when the cemetery was formed. The one here we have, this is a large monument to John Bright Klingman. This is the other brother of Josiah Klingman. John Bright Klingman, who lived to be about 86, 87, had 2 wives, both by the name of Sarah. His first wife, Sarah, who bore him about 8 children, she died when she was working on the farm and tearing down a shed, and the shed collapsed on her. She died. He then turned around and married another woman named Sarah Boyer. Sarah Boyer bore him 2 children. One was Hannah, who died as an infant, and then the other one was Wells Boyer Klingman. He survived and became an adult. But John Bright Klingman has both of his wives buried here and also some of his grandchildren, etc. Over there, you see some more Klingmans. You'll see Hiram Klingman, who was the cousin of Josiah, first cousin. And also in other sections here, there are several more Klingmans. The one who's missing, who was a significant factor in the history here, was Abner Klingman. His wife is buried here. Some of his grandchildren are buried here, but he lived to be 94, 95, and he moved with part of the family to Oregon. He died in Oregon, and he is buried there. So roughly, you probably have somewhere between 40 and 45 or 50 Klingman-related people buried in this section, and there are a considerable number on the other side. In fact, where my car is parked there, you'll see William Klingman. William Klingman, my wife's great-grandfather, was the son of Josiah Klingman. Pardon me. All right, now, you will see a number of very large monuments: Hutchison, Bell, Wilson, and several others. Really, those are relatively modern, and what they really reflect is not necessarily so much all the people who were mentioned on those monuments are not necessarily buried here. It is more of a family record. Okay, they may be buried here, they may not be buried here. The Hutchisons is an old-line family. The Youngs, the Wilsons, the Bells. The Bells and the Youngs and the Hutchisons were among the first, and they primarily settled in the Dakota area and the Lancaster Township area. Okay, now I'm going up here to the Addams section. I'm going to mention them because, like the Klingmans, they were a major group of people buried here. We all think in terms of Jane Addams and maybe her father John Addams, but there are probably about 35 Addams or 40 buried in this area, not necessarily by that name. Over there where you have the 4 pylons, that's the basic Addams cemetery plot. Now John Addams owned all this land. He came here in 1844, he owned all this land, and he had 3 infant children who died under the age of 2, or actually under the age of 1. There was Georgiana, there was Horace, and there was George. They're all buried here. Okay, but this was not a cemetery when they died. They died 1851, 1852, 1853, but he owned this land. What did he do? He owned this land, he chose the highest point, and he buried his 3 infant children there. There was a 4th child, Martha, who died at the age of 16, almost 17. She is also buried there. Martha was attending Rockford Female Seminary at the same time, not the same time, but before Jane Addams attended there. She died of typhoid fever in March, just before she was ready to graduate, and she was brought back here. One of the interesting things is that Martha and her sister Sarah, Martha and Sarah, were roommates of one of the Klingmans, and we have records of. We have a book of letters exchanged between Eliza Klingman, the oldest Klingman girl, with Sophia Klingman, the youngest Klingman girl, at the time when Sophia was attending Rockford Female Seminary. We have a total of, I think, 57 letters. And they're fascinating reading, not because they contain anything really outstanding in the way of events, but Eliza is constantly relating all the little things that were happening on the farm or in Cedarville, the marriages, the deaths, the drunks, this type of thing, okay? Whereas Sophia is relating all the day-to-day events in Rockford Female Seminary, okay? Which, by the way, Rockford at that time was known also as Forest City at that time. So it's fascinating to read these particular collection of letters back and forth, and so on. Now, also buried here, you will find John Addams and his first wife, Sarah. As I said, you'll find Horace, you'll find George, Martha, Jane Addams, who is there buried by that one. The wreath was just put up by the Northern Illinois chapter, various branches of the American Association of University Women. Jane Addams was one of the original founders of that group in 1888, 1889. Now, it's interesting to see what has happened here. We don't have all of the direct Addams people buried there. Why? Probably because they ran out a little bit of space, so they had to come outside. So here we have John Weber Addams, the only surviving son of John Addams, John Weber Addams. Here we have Laura Shoemaker Addams. She was from Lena, and she is buried here. That's John's wife. They had one daughter called Sarah, named after John's sister, Sarah Alice. Sarah, she's buried here with her husband. Her name was Sarah Young. She had no children. So the Addams name, insofar as John Addams is concerned, died out because he had four surviving. I'm sorry, he had three surviving daughters and a surviving son. The son's daughter never had any children, would have lost that name anyway. Jane Addams, of course, never married. There was Sarah Alice, who married into the Holloman family, and then there was Mary Lynn. So the Addams family died out when that particular line died out. That is the Addams family with a double D from the standpoint of John Addams. John Addams did have a brother who came here, James Addams. Okay? Now James Addams had several children. I don't want to go into that, but there are quite a number of them who are surviving. In fact, I ran across one of the survivors about a week or so ago. Now, here, I think I mentioned to someone that when years ago, the cemetery ended right about in there. You'll notice that depression. That land was actually brought in and added, okay? Why? Because we wanted to bury some more Addams people. All right, who do we want to bury over here? You don't have to go over and take a look at them, but if you wish, you may. There is John Addams' second wife, Anna Hofstetter Holloman Addams. Next to her is her first husband. Behind there are the two infant children they had. These were dug up after the death of Anna and brought here. Now the interesting thing is she must have known she was going to die, and she must have made these arrangements long beforehand, because the reburial of her first husband and her two infant children took place 3 days after she was buried. She had premonition, or she had made some arrangement beforehand. So what you'll see over here is you have the two infant children, Anna Hofstetter Holloman Addams, William Holloman, and then over here, George Holloman. Now George Holloman was her stepson, her son, that she brought into the Addams family. And it was always a thought that Jane Addams and George were going to get married. Well, it never happened. And the second Mrs. Addams, the story goes, she blames Jane Addams for breaking her son's heart, and that's why he died. Actually, he was physically kind of weak. He had some mental problems and so on. So I'm sure that Jane Addams had nothing whatsoever to do with it. So there's George Holloman. Next to here is Sarah Alice Holloman. Okay, why Holloman? That's John Addams' daughter, Sarah Alice Addams, because she married Dr. Henry Holloman, her stepbrother. Okay, so here we have Dr. Henry Holloman, his wife, who is actually John Addams' daughter. Next to that, we have Anna Marcette Holloman Julius. That's their daughter. She is known primarily in history as just Marcette. Okay. This was her husband, Emmanuel Holloman Julius. They hyphenated their names. He was the son of Russian immigrants. He was the one who, if anyone, I guess none of us are old enough to remember the little blue books that came out during the 1920s and so on. For a nickel, for a dime, you would buy them. They were able to take War and Peace and condense it to 64 pages, that kind of thing. Small pages too. But he started a publishing company and financed to a certain extent by Marcette. Down there you have Marcette's daughter, Alice, and Marcette's son, Henry, okay, and Marsette's husband. Over there. No, Marsette's daughter's husband. Okay. Their daughter, who is also named Marsette, is still alive today. She lives in Leesburg, Florida. She is a member of the Historical Society. She comes up to see us about every year, year and a half. Wonderful person. On top of which, she owns all of that farmland across the street from the cemetery. Her mother, Sarah Alice Addams Holloman, owned all of this land surrounding the cemetery, all that land over there, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres at one time. The only land still remaining in the possession of the Addams family right now is roughly about 250, 300 acres of farmland there, plus the wooded land there, plus every bit of land touching on Cedar Creek from Red Oak Road to Cedarville Road, with the exception of a little piece over here which belongs to that corner house. Okay, but other than that, she owns all of that land, plus the hunting land that is up there. She comes out there, as I say, every year, year and a half for something to visit. Scattered around here, you'll see stones for the Young family. You'll see them for the Hulbert family. Those are all descendants of John Addams.
And where is John Addams' grave?
Here.
It says mother, father.
Yep, they're all, I think there's a total of 8 of them buried in this section. Well, you can count from the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I guess there's 7 buried here altogether.
The names on that stone.
They don't necessarily correspond with the people how they're buried here.
Oh, okay.
That's
so
kind of like a
everybody-
family. That's kind of like a family monument.
Yeah, and it's all the way around.
All the way around, all the way around. Here you have Sarah and John. Sarah, by the way, died. She was pregnant with her 9th child. She helped another woman deliver a child, and on her way back from that delivery, she apparently tripped, fell, and she was probably about 8 months pregnant. She lost that child, and within a month or so after that, she died also. Now, she was about 5, 6 years older than John Addams, so she was in her early 40s when she lost that last child. So she is there, John is there, Jane is there, and there are 3 infant children are there. Plus, I think Martha's here too. Yeah, Martha, the one who died. In other words, there are 4 children that died before they reached actual adult maturity are buried here, along with the parents and Jane. Now, I don't know if I'm exactly following what's in the book, but I'll hit, since I'm down here, I'm going to hit the Wilcoxons. I mentioned to you about the Wilcoxons. Strange story. We have a monument here for Levi Wilcoxon and for Reason Wilcoxon. R-E-Z-I-N, I've seen it spelled R-E-A-S-O-N. They were brothers. They, along with Thompson Wilcoxon, owned virtually everything around Scioto Mills. Virtually everything. Levi and Reason died within 24 hours of each other in December of 1853. Where were they buried? Frankly, we don't know where they were buried. One of our guesses is that they were originally buried possibly on their farm down there, or possibly on the farm of their brother Thompson Wilcoxon. Okay, that land was very close to the Pecatonica River. We don't know, we suspect that maybe the river flooded, may have washed away part of that cemetery, may have washed away bodies. All we know is that about 20 years ago, they held an auction down in that area for one of the farms, and sitting on the farmland where the auction was being held was a big pile of monuments. And one of the people at the auction asked the auctioneer, could he have one of those monuments? So he picked it up, took it with him, and it happened to be a monument about yay tall, Levi Wilcoxon. Levi Wilcoxon. Well, this guy didn't know what to do with that monument, so eventually he brought it over to the old museum and dropped it off there. Told Ron Beam, who was the curator at that time, that it was there. Ron said, okay, fine, just leave it here, turn it face down so we don't ruin the inscription. When we got the school building, we brought that monument over and laid on the ground face down at the museum. We're not sure if that was was a monument for the original burial or not. Is it possible that the bodies were simply taken up and buried here? We don't know what's under that slab that's collapsing. Now, it's very possible that could be Levi Wilcox and several other family members that are buried there, but there is no record of it. And as I say, next to it, you have the monument for his brother. The reason for the star down there is because it's also a monument for Oscar Wilcoxon, who was a son of Reason, who was in the Civil War. That's the reason for the star there. All right. It would be wonderful if we could find out what's here, but the cemetery is kind of reluctant to break open that concrete. Now, over here we have a monument for the Pearsall family, father and son. Pearsall, I'm trying to remember what his first name was, Jeremiah. Jeremiah Pearsall is one of two sheriffs who are buried here in this cemetery. The other one is a Klingman, and he is buried in another part of the cemetery. He was a sheriff. He was in the Civil War. He's about 50, 52 years old. He served in the Civil War, was wounded, was shot in the arm. They never were able to take the bullet out, so somewhere in there is a Confederate bullet buried in a body there. His son was also in the Civil War, and he is buried in that also. I will skip down to these rather nondescript monuments. They have really no great historical significance. However, for those people who like these little footnotes on history, all right, this is the Eastman family. Edward, and I can't remember his wife's name. They were the parents. They came here from the East in the 1840s, late 1840s. They were the parents of Julia Eastman. Julia Eastman was a classmate of Jane Addams. Okay. Julia Eastman is the person who is responsible for telling us that Jane Addams, that was not her real name, her name was Laura Jane Addams, and the reason for that, according to Julia Eastman, is that Laura Jane Gorham was the favorite teacher of John Adams. He hired her for the post-8th grade private school that was held on the second floor of the, well, not the museum building because it's a different building there, but he hired her, and so when he had Jane, he named his daughter Laura Jane Addams after Laura Jane Gorham. Laura Jane Gorham only stayed several years teaching here. She married a colonel in the cavalry by the name of Henry Forbes. After the war was over, they went to Central Illinois and they resumed their teaching educational careers and eventually moved out, as I recall, to Oregon, and they died out there. But that's the only thing. For those who want the asterisk in history, you now have seen the family who indirectly has said that Jane Addams was named after Laura Jane Gorham. Okay, now we have to believe her or not believe her. Okay, we accept it though as being true. Okay. Now let's see over here. See if I can remember. Some of these things begin to look quite. Okay. Jones. All right, this is Robert Jones. Robert Jones was a very well-known, wealthy farmer north of Cedarville. And the only reason I'm pointing this out is that you'll see something which you don't see on any of these other monuments. In many cases, if they've had a son who's been killed in the Civil War, he will simply list his name on the monument, and you say, well, he's buried. Not buried. This is the one particular case where they have listed, okay, Daniel, W. Jones, all right, died November 7, 1863, age 22 years, buried at the Civil War. Mound City, Illinois, along with Alton, Illinois, and a few other places in the state, were the locations for military hospitals and cemeteries. So they have actually said, our son is not buried here, he is buried in Mound City, Illinois. Okay, here we have the Booker Monument. Anyone know who Dr. Booker was? Okay, his house still exists on Mill Street on the, what is it, that's the northeast corner, the brick house painted gray right at the present time. Dr. Booker was probably the best known of the doctors in Cedarville at the time. He died very young, in his 40s, middle 40s, late 40s. But Dr. Booker had, and the house on the corner is always known as the Booker home. Okay? However, I will point out an error there in a minute. Dr. Booker had a daughter by the name of Ida Mae Thompson. Dr. Booker's assistant was Dr. Thompson. Okay, Dr. Thompson married Dr. Booker's daughter, Ida Mae. Now, for a while, Dr. Thompson, S.C. Thompson, he worked out of Dr. Booker's home office. But after he and Ida Mae got married, they then moved onto Mill Street, and Dwayne lived in his house at one time. That's that frame Italianate on the corner of Oak and Mill Street. So Ida Mae lived there. Now we have a notation in the diary of Eliza Klingman saying that Dr. Thompson and Ida were married, and they went to Chicago for their honeymoon. They spent 3 days there, came back, and then Dr. Thompson built the house for his bride. So we have an exact approximate date as to when the house itself was built. So we have Dr. Thompson. Dr. Thompson is over here. This is Ida Mae here, Dr. Booker here. James Benson. James Benson was probably the first major merchant in town. Okay, he had his store on Mill Street. It no longer exists. Now, if anyone's familiar at all with Cedarville, you know where the telephone building is on Mill Street? The current telephone. Okay. If you look at that, to the right of that was a hotel and tavern, if you want to call it that, which was owned by a man called Peter Benetham. Peter Benetham, who was the father of Agnes Benetham, who was the wife of John Henning. Okay? And we know that Peter Benetham owned that property at least in 1860 because we have stories by his daughter about how she stood down there and watched the Union soldiers rehearse up on the hill where the school was. Okay? Now, immediately to the right of the hotel and tavern, which was not really much of a tavern and hotel, was the store and house of James Benson. First floor was the store, second floor, they lived there. They had moved there from that little, what we call the summer home, which still exists on the back of the property, slightly to the right. They lived there first, then they built that house in front. And they had the store in front, and then they had the house in the back. Now, that store was in competition with the Richards store, which was almost across the street from it, but they existed simultaneously. After the Civil War, James Benson stopped operating, or shortly after the Civil War, James Benson stopped operating the store, and he turned it over to his son-in-law, Dan Ilgen. Dan Ilgen had married Benson's daughter. Dan Ilgen started to operate the store. Dan Ilgen, and then at that time, Dan Ilgen, that would be roughly about 1865, Dan Ilgen died of a heart attack in 1900. Okay? Strangely enough, Richard died of a heart attack in 1900. So both of those businesses, the founders went out of business at that time. In the meantime, James Benson was building that house to the right of that. That's the place where Paul Fry currently lives. Okay? And we have a story that talks, actually a newspaper article that talks about the fact that James Benson in April of 1888 was going to face his new house with bricks being taken from the house to the right of the John Addams home. You now see a cottage up there. That cottage, that white cottage, was not built until 1887, 1888. There was a store, a brick store there for John Addams. They were going to take that brick and they were going to use it in the construction of James Benson's store. April 1888. He died in September of 1888, so he never got a chance to actually finish it. So what happened is that his son-in-law, Ilgen, and Benson's daughter moved into the house. And of course then Ilgen died in 1900. And the house went through several other ownerships, and now Paul Fry is the one who currently owns that particular house. All these little, again, another one of those asterisks of history. Now, we have a couple more, just a couple more, and we'll conclude. By the way, if I have any questions on these, for heaven's sakes, speak up. Let's see if I can pick these out now from all these nondescript ones that are here. Let's see. DeHaven. Let's see, that's DeHaven. That's John. Okay. All right, we have here what I mentioned about Dr. Bucher building the house, or living in the house there on the corner. He did not build that house. That house, that corner house, that was part of the John Addams addition, subdivision, about 7 or 8 lots altogether. The creamery was built on one lot. The creamery is now has been converted to a residence. But the brick house on the corner was built by a dentist who married into the Clingman family in 1851. He decided to leave the area, but before he left the area, his young child died, and so he had him buried in the Cedarville Cemetery. Okay? The husband and wife then left the area, went to Iowa. She stayed there for a while. He came back here for business purposes and died. And so they buried him next to his son. This is all part of, again, these are people related to the Klingmans. If you go through this cemetery here, you will find Goidel, Klingman, DeHaven, all kinds of names. But if you know who the spouses were in some cases, you can see what the actual relationship was. Now, I had mentioned about some of the Klingmans. As I remember Hiram up there, Hiram had a brother, Abner. Abner, as I indicated, eventually went out to Oregon and died there in his late 90s. However, I think it's one of these here. It isn't important which one it is, but it is his wife, Sarah. Sarah Woollever Klingman. She died while he was still living here. He buried her here. And then, down there, you will see monuments to many of his grandchildren. Silas, Gilbert, and so forth. Over here, everybody remembers, most people must know Leroy. Leroy Wilson? Okay. Leroy always talks about, he didn't live with his parents, he lived with his grandparents. Here they are. Grandma Mabel and Grandpa Joseph. They are buried here. And you'll also see then a plaque for Orville. Orville was his favorite. They were fairly close to each other. Orville was part of the storming of the beaches of Normandy during World War II. His body was never found. Always listed as missing, but they put a plaque here anyway. Okay? Now, the last part, to our knowledge, there is only one African American, black, whatever you want to call it, buried in Cedarville Cemetery. It's right here.
Was there a reason why Leroy did not live with his parents?
Yeah, his father was an alcoholic and his mother died early. Simple as that. Well, he would spend part of the time with his father. Okay, but he preferred to go back to eat with his grandmother because her food was better.
Yeah.
So he'd go to his father and eat, and then go back to grandma and eat. Anyway, William K. Biggs, 1878-1944. Laura, his wife, 1882-1965. Jane Addams died in 1935. After Jane Addams died in 1935, and by this time the second Mrs. Addams had died. She died in 1919. After Jane Addams died, the direct interest in the house disappeared. And in effect, the person who, I guess we'll say was the trustee of the house, was Marcette. And Marcette rented the house out. Now during that time period, Marcette and Mary Fry, for many years, lived in the cottage to the right. They rented the house out. In the 30s and very early 40s, the house was rented to Dexter Knowlton. Maura Knowlton's grandfather. Their servants were William Biggs and Laura Biggs. Now they did not live in the house. The best information I've got is they did live in Cedarville, but not in that house. They've told me the house they lived in, but I really cannot authoritatively pinpoint that house, so I'm not even going to say what it was. But when they died, they were buried here. Obviously, William died first, 1944. And on the very back, you see their picture there. Okay, I think I've covered everything I've got in the book. A few others. If there's any questions, what I'm planning on next year is picking another section of the cemetery. It's probably going to be still in that middle section, because middle section all the way up, because that's the oldest part. I will be doing that at that time. Any questions you got? I couldn't possibly. Now, since we had this on record, all the mistakes were shown. Oh yeah. I mean, in fact, they're adding. They purchased all that land. That all belongs to it. You'll notice they've been cutting down trees here. The next thing it'll do will be to take those out. The first pictures we have. Well, you see the first pictures of Cedarville, 1909. That shows a fence across there. There was a fence there at one time. But all of this is available to them. We started with 1 acre that John Addams donated, and then they bought another acre from the estate. And I understand that when it came time to buying some more land, at the time when Marcette's mother owned the land, there was a real fight. Trying to get some additional land. All that land you see over there, Charlie Road is over. That all belonged to Sarah Alice Addams home. When John Addams died, 1881, right after his daughter graduated from Rockford, when he died, he had been a state senator for 6 or 7 years. At that time, I think he had 3-year terms. When he died, one of the things he did during his term is he wrote the inheritance law of the state of Illinois, which in effect said if you did not leave a will, this is the way your property was going to be divided up. 1/3 to the spouse, or 1/2 to the spouse or surviving spouse, and the rest with the children. Okay? And that's so when he died, he never left a will, because he figured he had already written his will. So if anybody says, here's the will of John Addams, they're lying. He never left the will. And that's what happened. The woman, his widow, Anna, got the house, and the other children then took all the rest of the property. And obviously they had a reckoning as to what was worth what, and so on. Jane Addams got some, Sarah Alice got some, Mary Lynn, who had married the Reverend John Lynn, she got some. And eventually, though, Jane Addams sold most of her land and used that to finance Hull House. And she had a lot of pieces. You know where Grandview Cemetery is? All that land surrounding that cemetery at one time belonged to Jane Addams. She sold it, turned her money into Hull House, and so on. Well, Sarah Alice really came out smelling like a rose. I mean, she got all of that prime land, all of that land over there, and her descendants still own that piece of land over there. It's got a tenant farmer on it at the present time. The house that you see to the left, the farmhouse to the left, you can't see it from here, that also belongs to Marcette, the second Marcette. And there's a couple living there at the present time, but then there's a farmer who takes care of all of this land. That land up there, up to the next farmhouse, it's all their wooded land. It's hunted heavily for deer every year. You got to be careful going up there. Anything else?
Well, Jim, that Elgin house, the Benson house, that probably stayed in the Elgin family
For a long time.
because there was Carrie
Sure.
Elgin when we moved out there in 1960.
Didn't James have it original?
Carrie Elgin lived in there.
All right, there was a Paul and
Paul
James.
was her son.
Right. I think it stayed that way. Well, let's see. Prior to Paul Fry being there, you had the Murphys, of course. Now I don't know who the Murphys. Maybe they got it from one of the members of the Elgin family.
It was Ernie.
Reinhardt
Ernie Reinhardt lived there.
lived there right before that. Yeah, it has not gone through too many owners, but it's kind of strange. Here's this guy. He starts his very successful business, and then he dies before he can really enjoy what he's got there. There's two interesting stories about that building where the store was in. It was not torn down until the 1960s. And after Dan Elgin died, I guess his son tried to run it for a very short period of time. They just closed it up, left everything in there, just closed it up. And in the 1960s, when they tore the building down, there were still bolts of cloth in there, canned goods, etc. And we have about a 2.5-minute, very shaky video that shows them working in that particular area. Now, after World War II, housing was very difficult to come by. That house was still there. It was a store in the bottom, upstairs. And I think it was James Elgin came to Ruth, what was her name? Bob Wagner, Ruth Wagner. Ruth and Bob Wagner. Bob had just gotten out of the Navy. Ruth was a part of the, can't remember the family where she was from. Anyway, got out of the Army, Navy, and they were looking for a place to live, and James Elgin said, well, why don't you go live upstairs of the store? So Ruth told me the story that she went up there, climbed these stairs and so forth, got up there and found out the electricity was non-existent. You'd have to use kerosene lamps. There was no water up there. She'd have to carry up a wash basin and buckets of water. And she says she decided that was not for her. And so she turned down the possibility of renting out, even though houses were very difficult to find at that particular time. So, again, the asterisk. All these little stories have all these little things that go with them. Now, how long did you live at Dr. Thompson's for? We refer to it as Dr. Thompson's house. We don't call it, we don't call it your house. It's Dr. Thompson's house.
Well, we lived 63 to 33 years.
33 years. Okay. Now, did you buy it from his son? Dr. Thompson died in 1932.
No, we bought it from Glenn Hutchison.
From Glenn. Okay. Because I know that Dr. Thompson died in 32, and he lived quite long. And then, of course, there was that little addition, okay, where he had his office. Now, it's the only lot of that original subdivision where you've got that additional 30, those lots are 70 feet wide there, because we happen to have one there, okay? But the additional 30 feet to the north of it was added on so that he could have his office. And that's why you have that little house next to that. That's built on a 40-foot wide lot. Strangely enough, that also at one time belonged to Dr. Lightson. Okay? At one time we really had, we always refer to Dr. Thompson and Dr. Booker. Okay? But actually there was a Dr. Lightson there was another doctor there in that general area too. And that little building after Dr. Lightson had it, I think became a jewelry store for a while. Okay, yeah. So again, another one of those little aspects. All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Well,
That was
all right.
really interesting.
Okay, thank you there. All righty. Okay. All righty. And you too, thank you for coming along. Okay.
Is there a Rocky buried on that other road over there? It seemed
Oh,
to me
yeah.
that we saw a monument, but we couldn't.
Yeah, there's a Rocky. I think he's on.
You can
Left?
see it.
Yeah, you can see it from the road. I can't remember if it's on the left hand or right
Slowly
hand.
out there.
Okay. Did you pay my treasure there?
No. Oh, you said is that the treasure?
Yeah.
I didn't know who he was.
Hey, Dwayne.